She pressed her forehead against the cold wood of her mother's casket and prayed no one could hear her breaking. They could. And they laughed anyway. The Riverside Memorial Chapel in Charleston, South Carolina had seen real grief before, the kind that makes a room hold its breath. But on this Tuesday afternoon in March, something ugly had crept in wearing Italian leather and carrying a champagne flute to a burial. Janice Hoover knelt at the casket's edge, one hand pressed against the polished mahogany, the other curled into a fist at her side. She wore a black lace dress her mother had picked out for her years ago and had only just noticed still smelled faintly of lavender oil. That was the detail that nearly broke her. Not the whispers. Not the phone's recording. The lavender. I mean, truly. The voice cut through the chapel like a butter knife, not sharp, just persistent. Sandra Graham stood near the flower arrangements looking like she had wandered in from a country club fundraiser, champagne glass raised just slightly, as if toasting an occasion. What exactly did that woman leave behind? Besides the dress on Janice's back. The Graham family circled the chapel with the casual confidence of people who had never been told they did not belong somewhere. Jason Graham, Janice's husband, stood near the side wall with his arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the floor. He had not spoken since they arrived. He would not. That was worse than the laughing. She worked hospital cafeteria shifts and sold sweet potato pies on DeKalb Avenue. That was Chloe, Jason's younger sister, snapping a photo of the casket arrangement. For what? So her daughter could marry up and still end up crying at the bottom of a funeral pit. Janice heard every word. She had learned to hear everything while appearing to hear nothing. Her mother had taught her that. Rosie Hoover, who had scrubbed floors at Emory University Hospital for 27 years and never once looked like someone building an empire, had raised her daughter on one principle above all others. Let them think you're small. Small things don't get watched. Sandra stepped closer, heels clicking against the chapel's marble floor like a slow countdown. She lowered her voice just enough to seem civil. We should talk, Janice. About the estate. About the Graham house. About the future, which frankly, doesn't include you anymore now that the woman who dragged you into this world is gone. Janice lifted her head. Slowly. Deliberately. The kind of slow that makes people nervous. Her eyes met Sandra's, calm as stone, steady as a verdict. I'm going to bury my mother with the dignity she deserves, Janice said quietly. And then I am going to remember every single thing said in this room today. Sandra laughed. Remember it for what? Janice did not answer. She turned back to the casket and placed her palm flat against the wood one last time. She whispered something no one could hear. But if the laughter had stopped just long enough, they might have heard two words, thank you. Because in her coat pocket, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, was a letter from her mother's attorney in Atlanta. A letter that began, Your mother has left you everything. And everything, it turned out, was rather a lot. The world had never known what Rosie Hoover was doing. It had only ever known what she looked like she was doing. And what she looked like, for 27 years, was a tired woman in non-slip shoes who smelled like industrial cleaner and counted coins on the bus ride home. She had been 19 when Janice was born. Unmarried. Abandoned by a man who left his forwarding address as figure it out yourself. The world had met her with what it always offers young black mothers with no money and no safety net. Nothing. Landlords in Atlanta's Vine City neighborhood raised rent the month she brought the baby home. Her family offered prayers but not shelter. Her employer offered 2 weeks of unpaid leave. So Rosie had gone to work. She was 22 when she got the night shift at Emory. 24 when she picked up a second job selling sweet potato pies and collard green plates from a folding table on DeKalb Avenue on weekends. People walked past her every Saturday the way they walked past a fire hydrant. Present, necessary, invisible. She was watching all of them. She watched how the hospital administrators talked in hallways about expansion grants, about federal programs being renewed, about which neighborhoods were slated for rezoning. She watched which medical supply vendors got contracts renewed year after year without scrutiny. She absorbed every detail, filing it away the way a soldier studies terrain. And in the dark of her apartment, after Janice was asleep, Rosie Hoover opened textbooks she had checked out from the Auburn Avenue Library and learned. Not quickly. Not easily. But completely. By the time Janice was 7, Rosie had opened a business account under the name RH Enterprises and used $312 to purchase shares in a small medical linen company that serviced Emory. Within 4 years, she had reinvested every dividend. By the time Janice was 12, RH Enterprises had a shell company registered through a Savannah attorney who owed Rosie a favor after she had quietly helped his ailing mother navigate hospital billing disputes. By the time Janice turned 16, her mother sat her down at their kitchen table in a 3-room apartment on Edgewood Avenue, placed a manila folder in front of her, and said, "This is what I've been building since the day you were born." Inside were incorporation documents, trust agreements, property deeds, holdings across Atlanta, Nashville, and Charlotte. Janice had stared at them with a particular disorientation of someone who has just discovered that the floor they have been standing on is actually the roof of something enormous. "Mama. We barely—" "How?" "Because they weren't watching me." Rosie had smiled. "I needed them to see a woman who couldn't possibly matter. So I became her. Every dollar I made, I split. Half kept us alive. Half built this." She reached across the table and took Janice's hands. "One day someone is going to try to take this from you, baby. When they do, you need to be patient enough and smart enough to let them think they already have." That night, alone in her room, Janice had wept without knowing exactly why. Maybe because she understood, for the first time, what her mother had spent 2 decades sacrificing. Maybe because she finally understood what the sacrifice had cost. 3 days before Rosie Hoover died of a heart attack at her post, still on shift, still showing up, she called her attorney in Atlanta and confirmed that all transfer documents were in order. She had timed it perfectly. She always did. Jason Graham had been kind, once. That was the thing about him Janice could never quite reconcile. Not the cruelty, because he was never exactly cruel. It was the early kindness she kept grieving. The specific version of him that had appeared 3 years ago at a gallery opening in Midtown Atlanta and spoken to her for 45 minutes about her work, her ambitions, the way she laughed before finishing her own jokes. He had looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room. And she, who had spent her entire life being decorative at best and invisible at worst in rooms like that, had believed him. She understood now that belief is a dangerous thing when it is built on someone else's performance. The moment they moved into the Graham estate in Buckhead, a 6-bedroom colonial the family had owned for decades, the performance ended. Before we dive deeper into this story, comment where you're watching from. Hit like if you enjoy billionaire love stories. Hit subscribe if you're ready for more drama, romance, and luxury. This isn't just a channel, it's a boredom pill. Now, let's dive right into today's story. Sandra Graham did not want Janice there. She had never tried to conceal it. Her displeasure operated like weather, constant, atmospheric, impossible to argue with. There were mornings Sandra rearranged Janice's place, sitting at the breakfast table without comment. Afternoon she hosted gatherings Janice was not told about until guests were already arriving. Evening she introduced Janice to business associates as Jason's friend, a small, deliberate omission that landed like a needle every single time. And Jason sat at the head of that table, fork in hand, eyes on his plate, saying absolutely nothing. Once, after a dinner party where Sandra had described Janice's background as charmingly grassroots to a room of people holding wine glasses worth more than Rosie's weekly pay, Janice had followed Jason to their bedroom and asked him plainly, "Why won't you say anything? She dismantles me in public and you just sit there." He had looked at her with his jaw working and his eyes distant, the particular look of a man who knows he is wrong and has decided that knowing is sufficient. "She's my mother. You don't understand how this family functions." "I understand perfectly. You're a coward." He flinched. He did not argue, because they both knew. After that night, Janice stopped expecting him to change. She started, instead, to prepare. She called her mother's attorney in Atlanta. She reviewed the documents she had memorized at 16. She confirmed, quietly, methodically, that everything was in order. And then she waited. She had become very good at waiting. Standing at her mother's gravesite in the Charleston cemetery, feeling the late March wind off the harbor on her face, Janice looked across the open ground at Jason Graham and felt the last thing she had expected. Nothing. Not rage, not love, not even grief for what they had been. Just the clean, quiet finality of a door clicking shut. Behind her, Sandra laughed about something. Chloe's phone flashbulb caught her peripheral vision. Janice reached into her coat pocket and felt the letter there, folded against her ribs. Tomorrow, the will would be read. Tomorrow, everything would change. And not one person standing at this grave had any idea what was coming. Offices of Whitfield and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower on Peachtree Street in downtown Atlanta. The conference room faced south, and in the morning light it looked like the kind of room where fortunes were made and destroyed with a stroke of a pen. Today, it would become a battlefield. The Grahams arrived 12 minutes early and took over the room the way people do when they have decided the meeting is a formality. Sandra sat at the head of the table. Jason took the chair beside her. Chloe had her phone out, already scrolling. Marcus, Jason's cousin, sprawled in a chair with the relaxed posture of a man expecting a windfall. "I give it 2 hours," Marcus said. "We sign some papers, Janice takes whatever the old lady left her, and we're done." Sandra smiled thinly. "Something appropriate, I'm sure." Janice arrived at exactly the scheduled time. She walked in wearing a simple black blazer, her hair natural, no jewelry except her mother's gold stud earrings. She sat at the far end of the table and folded her hands. The Grahams watched her the way cats watch something they have already decided is beneath them. She did not look at any of them. Mr. Gerald Whitfield entered a moment later. He was 71 years old, a former federal judge, and the kind of man whose stillness in a room made other people feel loud. He placed his briefcase on the table, arranged his documents with precision, and regarded the assembled family over his reading glasses. "Good morning. I'll be executing the last will and testament of Mrs. Rosemary Hoover. The estate is extensive. I'll proceed to the distribution directly." Sandra leaned forward. "Please." Mr. Whitfield adjusted his glasses. The total value of Mrs. Hoover's estate, inclusive of all medical facilities, real estate holdings, corporate subsidiaries, and liquid assets, has been assessed at approximately $104 billion. The room went somewhere else entirely. Marcus made a sound that was not a word. Chloe's phone clattered onto the table. Jason looked like a man who had just been informed of his own address and found he had never lived there. "That is a mistake," Sandra said. "It is not," Mr. Whitfield said. "That is impossible. That woman sold food from a folding table. That woman also owned 4 hospital systems, 19 commercial properties across Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, and held controlling shares in 11 subsidiaries, among them a company called Graham Health Services, which your family has operated for the past 13 years under the belief that you owned it." Complete silence. "Graham Health Services," Sandra repeated, barely audible, "is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Rosie Hoover Medical Trust. Has been since it was quietly acquired in 2011, when the company was 11 months from insolvency. Mrs. Hoover purchased it through a holding entity, restructured the debt, and allowed your family to continue operating under your own name because," he paused and glanced at Janice, "she had reasons to let you remain unaware." Janice sat perfectly still. Jason was looking at her now. For the first time in months, he was genuinely looking at her. She did not return it. "The sole beneficiary of Mrs. Hoover's estate," Mr. Whitfield continued, "is her daughter, Janice Hoover. Everything, unconditionally, irrevocably, is hers." Sandra stood so fast her chair scraped the floor. "We will contest this. Every word of it. You are welcome to try, Mrs. Graham. I should inform you that Mrs. Hoover anticipated precisely that response. Any legal action brought against this estate triggers an automatic forfeiture clause. All employment benefits, compensation packages, and assets tied to Graham Health Services dissolve immediately upon filing." Sandra stared at him. And for the first time in the 9 years Janice had known her mother-in-law, Sandra Graham had nothing to say. Janice rose slowly from her chair. "Any immediate instructions, Ms. Hoover?" Mr. Whitfield asked. She looked down the length of the table at the family who had mocked her mother's memory 4 days ago in a chapel 30 miles from here. "Not yet," she said quietly. "But soon." The Grahams filed the lawsuit on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, the contingency clause had been triggered. By Friday, the paychecks stopped. Sandra had genuinely not believed it would happen. That had been her first mistake, believing that the rules applied to everyone except the Grahams. She had spent 57 years operating under that assumption, and until now, the world had largely confirmed it. But Rosie Hoover had spent 27 years building a legal structure specifically designed to collapse on anyone who tried to take it from her daughter. Every contingency clause was airtight. The Grahams' own lawyers, expensive ones, from a firm on Piedmont Road, reviewed the documents and came back looking like men who had been told their car was not actually their car. "Mrs. Graham," one said carefully, "this structure is among the most sophisticated estate architectures I have encountered in 30 years of practice. Whoever built it anticipated every angle of attack. Can we win?" A pause. "No." Sandra fired him. She hired someone else. That lawyer said the same thing. Meanwhile, the household expenses that had previously flowed invisibly through Graham Health Services stopped. The country club membership lapsed. The car notes, 3 of them, on vehicles Sandra had leased through company accounts, came due. The personal chef was let go on a Tuesday. The housekeeping service the week after. In Chloe's apartment in Virginia Highland, the lights went out on a Friday night. She called her mother screaming, and Sandra, for the first time in her life, could not fix it. Marcus left Atlanta without telling anyone where he was going. And Jason tried to find work. His resume, assembled honestly, was a document of managed irrelevance. Every position he had held had been created for him inside the family company. He had no independent references that had not come through his mother's contacts. He interviewed at 7 companies in 6 weeks and received 6 polite rejections and 1 silence. At night, he sat in the kitchen of the apartment he had rented after the Buckhead estate was vacated, and he thought about the woman who had sat at the far end of that conference table with folded hands and an expression like someone who had already seen this movie and knew how it ended. 6 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, Sandra arrived at the headquarters of the Rosie Hoover Medical Trust in Midtown Atlanta. She did not have an appointment. Janice saw her anyway. Sandra walked in wearing clothes that were still expensive but slightly wrong, a blouse that needed pressing, shoes she had clearly had for years. She looked like a photograph of herself from better days, slightly faded. "I want to propose a settlement," Sandra said. "Then propose one. We drop the suit. You reinstate our positions. We return to business as it was." Janice studied her for a long moment. "Do you remember what you said at my mother's funeral? You said she spent her life scrubbing floors and left me poorer than she found me. You said it loud enough for everyone to hear." Sandra's jaw moved, but nothing came out. "I am not interested in a settlement." Janice's voice was steady as river stone. "The lawsuit continues. The clause stands. When you lose, and you will have nothing. Exactly what you came to that funeral to celebrate." Sandra stared. "You can't do this." "I already have," Janice said. "You can see yourself out." Sandra left. And the door closed so quietly it was almost an insult. The federal courtroom in Atlanta's Richard Russell Building was standing room only. It had started as a civil inheritance dispute. It had become something the media could not look away from. The billion-dollar cleaning woman, the hidden empire, the family who had laughed at a funeral and was now suing the grieving daughter for the inheritance they hadn't known existed. The Grahams' attorney, a tall man named Preston Vale who charged $900 an hour and had never lost a case he considered important, opened confidently. He stood before Judge Darlene Moss, a woman who had been on the federal bench for 19 years, and argued that Rosie Hoover could not conceivably have built this empire without fraud or manipulation. She was a woman with a 9th-grade education who worked service jobs her entire life. The financial structures attributed to her are beyond sophisticated. They are the work of people who knew exactly what they were doing, which, with the greatest respect, was not her. Judge Moss made a note. Then it was Mr. Whitfield's turn. He did not perform. He presented. He placed before the court 32 years of documented decisions, bank statements showing incremental investment activity dating to 1992, notarized corporate filings in Rosie Hoover's own handwriting, video recordings of Rosie Hoover attending board meetings at facilities she owned through shell entities, testimony from 7 attorneys and 4 accountants who had worked with her directly. Mrs. Hoover did not have access to the institutions that teach what she learned. She built that access herself. Education is not intelligence. Education is opportunity. Mrs. Hoover didn't have the opportunity. She created it. The courtroom was very quiet. Then Mr. Whitfield introduced the second layer of evidence. Rosie had prepared for this. She had always prepared. On the screen at the front of the courtroom appeared a date-stamped video recording from 4 years ago. Location: the Graham Estate dining room in Buckhead. Sandra Graham's voice came through clearly. "We need to move Janice out, Jason. She doesn't fit. I've spoken to our attorney. We can file for divorce on incompatibility grounds and ensure she receives nothing. Not a cent. I've already identified someone more suitable for you." Jason's voice: "If you think it's best." Sandra's voice: "I do." The courtroom had the particular quality of air that follows the arrival of something undeniable. Mr. Vale objected. Judge Moss overruled. The recording had been obtained legally under Georgia's single-party consent statute. Rosie Hoover had known it might be needed. She had made sure it existed. There were 3 more recordings. Chloe and Marcus filming Janice at the funeral while laughing. A call between Sandra and an attorney discussing how to leave Janice with no legal foothold in the Graham estate. A meeting in which Sandra had been preparing to eject Janice for over 2 years. When it was done, Preston Vale sat down and did not stand up again. Judge Moss looked at the Grahams for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. The plaintiff's case is dismissed. The contingency provisions outlined in the estate documents are upheld. All assets tied to Graham Health Services through personal employment are to be forfeited immediately. The court imposes sanctions for the filing of a frivolous action against a demonstrably valid estate. The gavel came down. Janice felt it in her chest like a door finally closing properly after years of sticking. She did not cry. She did not smile. She simply gathered her things, thanked Mr. Whitfield quietly, and walked out of the courtroom toward the light at the end of the corridor. Behind her, she heard Jason say her name. She kept walking. The press conference was held at the Rosie Hoover Medical Trust headquarters on a Thursday at 10 a.m. Janice stood at the podium in a room full of cameras with her mother's gold earrings on and her mother's words in her chest. "My mother spent 30 years building something extraordinary. She did not build it in the light. She did not build it with recognition, with funding, with a network, or with anyone's belief that she was capable of it. She built it in the hours after her shifts were done, with money she saved instead of spending, with intelligence she had always possessed but was never afforded a platform to display." She paused. "Today I am announcing the full restructuring of the Rosie Hoover Medical Trust. All hospital facilities under our umbrella will implement immediate reforms. Living wages for all staff, employer-funded health care for support workers, on-site child care, paid leave, and no-cost educational assistance for any employee seeking advancement." The room applauded. She waited for it to quiet. The Rosie Hoover Scholarship Fund will provide 100 full scholarships annually to students from low-income backgrounds pursuing degrees in medicine, law, and business. Priority will be given to students from the Atlanta communities my mother came from. More applause. And Graham Health Services will be renamed the Rosemary Hoover Medical Group. It will continue to operate. But under new leadership that has never confused wealth with worth, it will serve the communities that corporate medicine has spent decades ignoring. She looked directly into the nearest camera. My mother was not nothing. She was not a cautionary tale about poverty. She was the most sophisticated financial mind I have ever known, and she built her empire quietly because the world was not designed to let her build it any other way. I intend to change that. The room erupted. Somewhere in a studio apartment in Buckhead that cost Sandra Graham $1,400 a month, Sandra watched the press conference on her laptop with the volume barely on and her hands folded in her lap and said nothing. Chloe watched it from her phone on her lunch break from a retail job she had started 10 days ago. She did not post anything. Jason watched it alone in his apartment kitchen. He watched it twice. Then he sat in silence for a long time. And somewhere in his jacket pocket, slightly worn at the edges from being handled too many times, was an envelope. An envelope that Rosie Hoover had given him 5 years ago, on an afternoon she had run into him at a hospital cafeteria, before he had ever formally met her daughter. An envelope she had pressed into his hand at the end of a 10-minute conversation and said, "Deliver this to Janice. But only when you have become someone who deserves to deliver it." He had carried it for 5 years. The envelope was standard cream-colored, the kind you buy in packs of 20 at any drugstore. Rosie Hoover's handwriting was on the front in blue ink. For Janice. When the boy becomes a man. He had not opened it. He had been afraid of what was inside, and also of what his having it meant, that a woman scrubbing cafeteria floors had seen him more clearly than he had ever seen himself. 3 years after the trial, he requested to see Janice. She declined. He requested again, 6 months later. She declined. He had spent those 3 years doing actual work, a medical records coordinator position at a community health clinic in Vine City, a neighborhood he had driven through without stopping his entire life. He took the MARTA train to work and ate lunch in a break room with people who had worked there for decades, making what he used to spend on a single dinner. He attended therapy. Twice a week for 18 months, then once a week after that. He was doing it, he told himself, because he had stood at a chapel wall and said nothing while his wife's grief was made into entertainment, and he needed to understand how a person becomes capable of that. The understanding, when it came, was not comfortable. When he requested to see Janice for the 3rd time, she said yes. He arrived at the trust headquarters on a Wednesday morning wearing a button-down shirt he had ironed himself. He stood in the lobby and looked at the photographs on the walls. Hospitals, scholarship recipients, community centers, the faces of people whose lives had been changed. He recognized none of the faces. He had never been in any of those buildings. He understood, standing there, that this was precisely the point. Janice's office was on the 15th floor. She was seated behind a large desk, her posture the same composed stillness he remembered from the conference room. She looked older and more fully herself. "Hello, Jason." "Janice." He sat in the chair across from her and placed his bag on his lap. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm not here to apologize again. I'm here because your mother gave me something a long time ago." He reached into the bag and placed the envelope on the desk between them. "She gave me this 5 years ago. Before I ever formally introduced myself to you. I don't know how she knew, she said she did. She told me to deliver it when I'd earned the right to, which she defined as understanding what it means to have nothing." He paused. "I think I'm starting to understand." Janice looked at the envelope for a long time without touching it. "She met you before we met. At Emory. I was visiting someone. She was working the cafeteria. We talked for about 10 minutes. Janice finally picked up the envelope. Her mother's handwriting. The specific slant of it. "Thank you for bringing it," she said quietly. "You can go." He stood. At the door, he paused. "I'm not the man I was at that chapel. I can't prove that to you, and I'm not asking you to believe it. I just—" He stopped. "Tried again. I hope you're happy, Janice. Actually happy. Not surviving. Happy." She met his eyes for a moment. Then he left. The door closed softly. She opened the envelope alone. "My dearest Janice. If you're reading this, then Jason finally became someone worth delivering it. I knew he would fail you. I saw it in him the day we met. Not cruelty, but something more dangerous. The capacity for cowardice. Men like that aren't malicious. They've been built by people who taught them that comfort is the same thing as strength, and they live their whole lives mistaking the two. I also knew he would find his way to something better. Eventually. People usually do when the floor falls out. But this letter isn't about him. It never was. This letter is about you, and about what I need you to do now that the storm is over. Let go. Not of what I built for you. Not of what you fought for. Not of the lessons that got you here. Let go of the need to keep winning. The war is done, baby. You won. But winning a war is not the same as living a life, and I spent too many years at the intersection of those two things to let you do the same. I built this empire in secret because the world made it impossible to build it in the open. I chose invisibility as a strategy, and it worked, and I am proud of it. But I also want you to know what invisibility cost me. It cost me the experience of being seen, of being known, of sitting with someone who understood everything I was carrying and not having to pretend it weighed less than it did. Don't do that. Not for anyone. Not even for the work. Use this power I've left you. Use it to build things for people who look like we looked, tired, invisible, essential, and dismissed. There is no better use of wealth than dismantling the conditions that made it necessary to hide it in the first place. But also, eat dinner with people you love. Take the trip. Buy the flowers, not for an occasion, just because. Sleep when you're tired. Grieve what you lost. The people who mocked me at my own funeral are going to see what you build. They're going to drive past the hospitals you open in communities they've ignored their whole lives. And that is enough. That is more than enough. You don't need to think about them again. Let them live with the knowledge of what they mistook me for. Let that be the last thing they carry. You carry only this. You are loved. You were always loved. You are extraordinary. Not because of what I left you, but because of who you became before you knew any of it existed. I am so proud of you, my quiet, fierce, brilliant girl. Go live now. All my love, always, Mama. Janice read the letter twice. Hello again, lovers and billionaires. We have come to the end of today's story. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think about today's story. I read every comment. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to enjoy more captivating stories like this. Until the next story, stay in love and leave billionaire level.